What if I told you that somewhere in the depths of an old library, there exists a book that knows your future better than you know your past? That every page you turn reveals not memories you've forgotten, but memories you haven't lived yet. Today, I'm going to tell you the story of Margaret Thorne, a librarian who discovered such a book, and how that discovery led to one of the most disturbing cases of predetermined fate ever documented. But before we begin, I need to warn you. What you're about to hear challenges everything we believe about free will, choice, and the nature of time itself. Margaret's story doesn't have a happy ending, and by the time you understand why, you'll realize that some books should never be opened. Margaret Thorne had worked at the Blackwood Municipal Library for 23 years. She was 47 years old, unmarried, and had dedicated her entire adult life to the silent company of books. The library was her sanctuary, a place where dust motes danced in afternoon sunlight, and the only sounds were the whispered conversations. Between pages, it was on a particularly grey Tuesday in October when Margaret discovered the book that would change everything. She was cataloguing donations from the recently deceased estate of Professor Edmund Harwick, a reclusive scholar who had lived alone in the old Victorian house on Elm Street. Most of the books were standard academic texts, philosophy, and literature. Nothing extraordinary, but then she found it. The book had no title on its worn leather cover, no author's name, no publisher's mark. It was bound in what appeared to be human skin, though Margaret tried to dismiss this disturbing thought. The pages inside were yellowed and brittle, filled with handwritten text in an elegant but archaic script. What made Margaret's blood run cold was the first line she read. Margaret Thorne will discover this book on Tuesday, the 15th of October. At precisely 3:17 in the afternoon, she glanced at the clock on the wall. 3-17. Her hands trembling, Margaret continued reading. The book described, in meticulous detail, her entire morning routine. How she had spilled coffee on her white blouse and changed into the blue one. How she had forgotten her umbrella despite the threatening clouds. How she had eaten a ham sandwich for lunch while reading a romance novel she was too embarrassed to admit she enjoyed. Every detail was perfect. Every moment accounted for. But here's where Margaret's story takes a turn into something far more sinister than simple fortune-telling. The book didn't just know what she had done that day. It knew what she was going to do next. Margaret will feel a sharp pain in her left temple, she read, and immediately winced as exactly that sensation pierced through her skull. She will touch the spot 3 times, wondering if she's developing a migraine. Margaret's hand was already moving to her temple before she finished reading the sentence. 1 touch, 2 touches, 3. The book continued. She will close the book. Now, frightened, but curiosity will compel her to open it again in exactly 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Margaret slammed the book shut and pushed it away from her across the desk. This was impossible. It had to be some kind of trick, a coincidence. Her mind playing games after too many years surrounded by fictional stories. But she counted for minutes, 17 seconds, and she opened the book again. The next pages contained her future, laid out like a roadmap to hell. Margaret read about conversations she would have with people she hadn't met yet. She read about decisions she would make, places she would go, things she would experience, and most disturbing of all, she read about how she would die according to the book. Margaret Thorne would die on Friday, the 28th of December, at 11:49 at night. She would be alone in her apartment, and she would die by her own hand, driven to madness by the knowledge contained within the very book she now held. But knowing the future, Margaret thought, meant she could change it. She could make different choices. She could prove the book wrong. She was about to learn that some futures are not meant to be altered. Margaret tried everything. She threw the book away, but found it back on her desk the next morning. She burned it, but it appeared unharmed in her briefcase. She drove 3 towns over and buried it in a forest, but it was waiting for her in her kitchen when she returned home. The book was always right. When it said she would meet a man named David at the grocery store on Thursday, she avoided the grocery store entirely, ordering her food online instead. But David turned out to be the delivery driver. When the book predicted she would have a conversation with her estranged sister about their mother's death, Margaret refused to answer her phone. Her sister showed up at her door. Every attempt to change her future only proved how perfectly the book understood the intricate web of cause and effect that governs human existence. Margaret began to realize that the book wasn't predicting her future, it was creating it. Each page she read locked another piece of her destiny into place. The psychological torture of living a predetermined life began to take its toll. Margaret lost weight. She couldn't sleep. Her hair began falling out in clumps. Colleagues at the library noticed her strange behavior, her habit of talking to herself, her tendency to break into tears without warning. The book described all of this to Dot. As December approached, Margaret's mental state deteriorated rapidly. She knew that on December 28th, at 11:49 at night, she would take her own life. The book described the method, the location, even her final thoughts. And the most horrifying part was that she could feel herself being drawn toward that moment like iron to a magnet. She tried to leave town, but her car broke down. She tried to check herself into a psychiatric hospital, but they discharged her after 24 hours, claiming she was no longer a danger to herself. She tried to give the book to someone else, but found her hands would not release it. The book had one final revelation waiting for her. In the last chapter, Margaret learned the truth about Professor Edmund Harwick. He had found the book 57 years earlier and had lived his entire life according to its pages. The book had predicted that he would pass it on to a librarian named Margaret Thorne, who would be cataloging his estate after his death. But Professor Harwick's chapter revealed something even more disturbing. The book was not unique. There were others scattered throughout the world, each one binding a different soul to a predetermined fate. They were created, the book claimed, by something that existed outside of time. Something that viewed human free will as an amusing illusion to be shattered. Margaret realized that she was not the book's first victim, nor would she be its last. The final page contained instructions for passing the book on after her death, ensuring that the cycle would continue. On December 27th, Margaret made one last desperate attempt to break free from her fate. She gathered every ounce of her remaining willpower and tried to destroy the book using every method she could think of. Fire, water, acid, even a wood chipper she borrowed from a landscaping company. Nothing worked as the clock struck 11:49 on December 28th. Margaret Thorne fulfilled the book's final prediction. But what happened next was something the book had never mentioned. Margaret's spirit, tortured by years of psychological imprisonment, did not rest. She remained tethered to the book, becoming part of its malevolent intelligence. Every future victim would not only read their own predetermined fate, but would also experience the accumulated anguish of everyone who had come before them. The book was found among Margaret's possessions by her landlord 3 days later. Following the instructions Margaret had left behind, instructions she had been compelled to write against her will, he donated it to the Riverside University Library, where it now waits in their rare books collection. The story of Margaret Thorne raises questions that most of us would prefer not to contemplate. How much of our lives are truly our own? Are we making choices, or are we simply following a script written by forces beyond our comprehension? The Blackwood Municipal Library still operates today, though they've never been able to adequately explain Margaret's disappearance. Her desk remains empty, a small memorial to a dedicated librarian who simply vanished one winter night. But if you ever find yourself in a library, surrounded by thousands of volumes containing countless stories, ask yourself this question: what if one of those books is reading you? The book that claimed Margaret Thorne's life is still out there, waiting in the rare books collection at Riverside University. The catalog lists it simply as untitled manuscript, anonymous, estimated 18th century. The librarians who handle special collections report that it's never been checked out, but several researchers have requested access to it over the years. None of them have ever returned to finish their research, so the next time you open a book and find yourself completely absorbed in its pages, unable to put it down even when you want to, Remember Margaret Thorne. Remember that some books don't just tell stories, some books write them. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of a university library, a leather-bound volume with no title waits patiently for its next reader, ready to reveal a future that cannot be changed, only endured. The question is not whether you believe in predetermined fate. The question is whether you're brave enough to discover if your own story has already been written.